right, ladies, here we go. The first day of week 4 was the paralyzed man who was let through the roof by his friends. And several things caught my attention. Number one, the word mat. You know, we look at it as a flat board, you know, in Sunday school, you know, the flannel graph flat board. But really it was a mattress just large enough for a person to lay on. So it could have been maybe the poor had sheepskin with the sheep fur still on it, the hair still on it. And it would really look almost like just a blanket, maybe a thicker version of a blanket. So when they carried him, it might have wrapped up around him, and so you didn't see him at all. He was actually all sunken in due to his weight. The roof with tiles. Poor people, so they got up and they moved the tiles. Poor people really only had one entrance onto the roof of their house, which was an extension of the house, and that was on the inside. So they didn't crawl up on the outside. They didn't have an extra set of stairs because this was Peter's house, and so it was poor. They didn't have money, so they probably came into the neighbors because houses touched walls. So got into the neighbors' house. They talked their way in, climbed over the roof onto the house where Jesus was, and then they moved the tiles. And tiles were often just pieces of pottery that weren't good enough for building or walls or other things with. So they were put in the roofs to try to help waterproof them just a little bit better. At least that's what it looks like. They didn't perhaps. The neighbor man, who is probably a fisherman too, you know, because people kind of tended to clump together. Maybe he lent them the rope and some of his fishing line. The healing proof that the healing was proof that Christ had power over sin because 1, he said it, and 2, Jews believed that a diseased person couldn't be healed until his sins were blotted out. So the disease was due to a sin. The sin had to be blotted for the man to be healed. So they were it was a 3-way miracle. The sins were forgiven, the thoughts were read, which from the Pharisees, and then the palsy or the paralysis was healed. Okay, next up, day number 2, and that was the man born blind. So I decided to look up about Pharisees and Sadducees. So the Sadducees were made up of the elite, and they were really associated with the ruling class. They became a thing after Cyrus the Great allowed the Hebrews back to Jerusalem. He allowed for like the priests to go, but he didn't allow for kings to be established. So he said, you can go back and rebuild the temple, but you couldn't have Jewish monarchy. You couldn't be ruled by a king. So the priests started to kind of develop a ruling thing. So the priestly power filled the gap. Now they weren't super popular because they were kind of, you know, a little bit uppity in their views. At the same time, the Council of Sages, which was also the Sanhedrin, may have started codifying the Hebrew Bible. So you had the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin were sages, the wise teachers, but the Sadducees were from the priestly class, okay? Then they say, and curiously enough, some people say that the leading sages of the Sanhedrin actually backed the rebellion by Simon Bar Kokhba, which is the guy who they preferred to think of as the Messiah 100 years after Jesus. So I thought that was really curious. Pharisees were fairly new in Jerusalem. They were established in 167 BC-ish. And it was a social movement and a school of thought. So this is a group of people that gathered up and said, you know, no, every man's a priest. There are priests, yes, but everybody should be, every Hebrew should be a priest. We should live like priests. We should focus on holiness. We should do the right things. And so they began to live by the law. So they were real law keepers. They were part of the scribes and sages. I think I told you that. And they really wanted to get everybody involved. So they were connected to the synagogue. So all the teaching and stuff came as part of the Pharisees in the synagogue. Curiously enough, all mainstream forms of Judaism today consider themselves heirs of the rabbinic Judaism, which was the Pharisees. So they felt like it would that they had all been from the same place. The Pharisees felt like they had free will, but God has foreknowledge, where the Sadducees, total free will, and the Essenes, which is another religious group, was no free will. So just to be clear, the Sadducees, Pharisees, and others like the Essenes and the Gnostics, they were all schools of thought or areas of types of Judaism or flares of Judaism. So the Sadducees, they actually became more of a political party than a spiritual leader. So as the years went by, they became just really more political. And we see that in the Bible. It becomes very clear in that. Let's see. Remember the Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's why they're sad, you see. And the Pharisees did believe in the resurrection of the dead. Gamaliel and Nicodemus were possibly Pharisees. Paul was a Pharisee as well. Let's see. Sadducees, the leadership was determined by birth, but in the Pharisees, the leadership was determined by intellect and ability. So the smarter or the wiser ones were the ones that rose to the top. They usually by scholarly achievement. And the man born blind who was in the temple, he was there was a reason for him to be there, because they went there at 3 different times of the year: Passover, Feast of Weeks, and Feast of the Tabernacle. Let's see. And curiously enough, only Christianity and the Pharisees, or the Pharisaism, survived the destruction of the temple. So after 70 A.D., the Pharisaical thought process became the dominant form of Judaism. So that, and then of course the Christians survived 70 AD, the destruction of the temple as well. Okay, next up, we're looking at day 3. Is that right? I get my days mixed up, and I hate to mess that up. But we're talking about the cripple by the pool of Bethesda. Okay, so I'm going to try to post this, but here's my map. And this is Bethesda, the pool of the Bethesda. This is the temple area, and there's some other stuff. There's a fort over here, and then this is where where Jesus was crucified, I believe. But I'll send you one of these so that you can have a look at it. And then there's also the way the pool was, because it says 5 walls. That's how it looks like. The wall, they shared a wall. Okay. So Bethesda, the Greeks created a cult called the Asclepius. I'm not very good at that. The pagan god of healing. So the Greeks had this god of healing. They believed that he and his friendly helper spirits, in the form of serpents, would stir up the waters. Now remember the healing. The Hippocratic Oath has the snake with the pole with the serpent around it. I don't know if that's connected, but it's sure curious, isn't it? So they would stir the waters, the serpents would stir the waters, and whoever would get in would be healed, according to the tradition. People would come to these places, and they would sleep in the altar area or near the water. They would sleep in the area that was designated as part of the altar, in hopes that they would either be first in the water when it was stirred, or they would get dreams on how to become well. So maybe hints of what was the sickness or what was affecting them and how to make it better. So it was curious that maybe Jesus was coming in actually facing down some of these Greek Jews, these Hellenistic Jews who had established this thought of the waters were being stirred and there was healing taking place. Now, also remember, it says that in the Bible that an angel was sent down to stir the waters once a day. Now, in the tradition of the Jews, it could be a good spirit or a bad spirit. So the angel or a spirit coming down or being sent down could be good or bad. So God would send both of those according to the Jews. Now, we believe that it was an angel. if it's from God, right? That he's in charge of that part of the world. The pool of Bethesda wasn't found until 1800s, and actually there was some question whether it was really valid until they found it, and so it was quite a big deal. So interestingly, from the pool of Bethesda, you could actually see the temple, and I have a picture that kind of shows that, so I'll put that on in my email as well. All right, the next day, this is for the healing of the lepers, the 10 lepers. So today, leprosy is treatable with multiple layers of drugs. There's 200,000 new cases per year. They can still live at home, so that's fine. There's 3 million living with the unfixable parts of the disability, so something has happened that they can't be repaired. It's usually spread by coughing or airborne droplets, but it's not very contagious, so that people don't feel like they have to be as separate as they once thought they were. It's found mostly in India, where more than half of leprosy cases are found, in Indonesia, Myanmar, Brazil, and Nigeria, so in the warmer parts of the world. 200 cases have been reported in the U.S. So in rabbinical literature, so we talked about Naaman as one of our verses. Naaman was the archer who mortally wounded Ahab, the king of Israel, in 1 Kings 22:34. So they say that Naaman was the guy who shot Ahab, which is supposedly alluded to in 2 Kings 5:1. One tradition said he was proud and haughty, and that's why he got leprosy. Another said he got it after taking on an Israelite maiden for his wife to serve his wife, and so people who did that had trouble, and so he caught the disease because he disobeyed God unknowingly by taking on this maiden. The Israelite king got a letter, right? So he was sent this letter, and he was like, I can't heal them. And so there's some debate as to who got that letter. Was it Jehoaz, or Jehu, or Jehoram? And they think it's Jehoram. I am obviously struggling with the words. So then Nahum wanted to take dirt with him after he was healed, and that really wasn't unusual back then, because in those days people viewed that the god of each land could only be worshipped on that land, right? So the god of the area had to have the part of the area there to worship. So Naaman taking some dirt with him, he was taking a place where he could worship God appropriately on the dirt. And he even says, I'm going to go and take care of my master, but just really to be clear, I want to worship God. 10 talents of silver, which was about 700 pounds of silver. And the 600 shekels of gold was about 150 pounds of gold. So it was a lot of money. If you think of if 1 pound of silver is $210 and 1 pound of gold is $18,000. I didn't go ahead and do the math, but that's a lot of gold that Naaman, the king, sent with Naaman for the king of Israel. And then Naaman tried to give to the prophet, and he wouldn't take it. Okay, the man with the shriveled hand, that's our next day. And the Sabbath. So I looked up some curious things about the Sabbath, because I just wanted to know what made it, I know what makes it a big deal spiritually, but what about it? It starts a few minutes before sunset on Friday, and it lasts until the appearing of 3 stars in the night sky on Saturday night. So before sunset on Friday through until the 3rd star, it can be seen on Saturday night. Here's a curious thing. It's an active abstinence. So it's ceasing from work. So just resting doesn't count, right? You have to actually not work. So they say it's you can't do final completion or fine tuning of something. So the candles for the Sabbath have to be lit before the Sabbath starts, because that's completing the act of lighting the candle. That's why no shopping or cooking. Really, they say no TV in modern times. You couldn't do things that were completed or were an act of completion, like adding hot water to ramen is an act of completion, and that wouldn't work. Or stapling a report is an act of completion, according to what I saw. And then you couldn't transfer between domains, so from domain to domain. So you couldn't take a private domain to a public thoroughfare, or an open area, something from an open area to an exempt area. So you had to keep it within the domain. You couldn't move it from something from domain to domain. That would be considered work, and it wasn't allowed. Okay, so I wanted to know, what were your favorites? What healing did you like the best, or what struck you in the most curious way? I hope you're doing well, and I will put some more stuff on. Keep it up. We're continuing on, and I am loving this, even though I don't get to see you very often. I'm really enjoying digging deeper into the Word, and I hope you are too. See you later.